Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people collectively recorded in my trees. Episode 11, PNG Gold. This episode is the story of Thomas Weaver Bayliss, who is my great-great-uncle. Throughout my life, I look back and notice that there were a few little clues to Thomas Weaver Bayliss. All I knew before I delved into Tom Bayliss was that my father had visited him at his home in the early 1970s with my grandmother, and he told me that Uncle Tom had given him a fossil from Papua New Guinea. He also told me that Uncle Tom had been a gold miner in Papua New Guinea, and as a child going through the family albums, I found some photos of my great-grandfather visiting Papua New Guinea, photos of active volcanoes, and my great-grandfather standing with native Papua New Guinean children. So with these little clues, it piqued my interest in what was Uncle Tom doing in Papua New Guinea, how long did he live there for, and I wanted to really look into also his descendants. From 15 years of research, I've managed to piece together a very full and rich story of not only Thomas Weaver Bayliss, but those connected to him. I was thrilled to make contact with Tom's son Colin and his wife June in 2010, as well as Tom's grandson Len, so my grandmother and her cousin Colin could get reacquainted with each other. It was lovely that they could get back in touch, as little did we know that all three of them were in the last 5 years of their lives. Thomas Weaver Bayliss was born on the 19th of October 1891 at Wanganella in New South Wales. He was the 9th child of 12, born to Philip James Bayliss and Matilda Mary Simons. And I have completed an episode earlier on Phil Bayliss, who is Thomas Weaver Bayliss's brother. And in that podcast, you would have noticed that I mentioned Tom, particularly when Phil Bayliss was in the Cyclist Corps over in World War I. So I'm just going to recap to talk to you about Thomas Weaver's parents, and this is also mentioned in Phil Bayliss's story. Philip James Bayliss was born in Kempsey, Worcestershire, England, and he was a sailor in the British Royal Navy. At the age of 16, he was a sailor on a British battleship, and at age 18, he signed up for 10 years' service on the ship the Black Prince. It seems Philip jumped ship in Australia in 1873, no doubt going to the port of Port Phillip at Melbourne after plying the spice trade on the coast of China. Why do I think that he jumped ship? There are no formal immigration records for Philip. However, we do know that he made his way up to Wanganella in New South Wales, and it is around 2 hours above the Victorian border, so no doubt he was ensuring that he avoided capture for being found to have jumped ship. Wanganella is a well-known area for the production of fine merino wool. This had vast properties, and sheep production was well underway in Wanganella. It was certainly a long way from the sea, so as a sheep overseer, which is the position he took on at a property called Boabula, it was something vastly different from sailing. When servicing the Navy at Plymouth, he met Matilda Simons, who lived across the bay at Cawsand, Cornwall. Matilda was a milliner, so she made hats, and she travelled over to Plymouth daily on the ferry. Matilda also had several family members who were in the Navy, and so the family story is that as Matilda was taking the ferry every day, they got to know each other. Once Philip settled at Wanganella, around 6 years after arriving in Australia, he sent for Matilda. She took 6 months to arrive on the ship, as her ship was becalmed in the Bay of Biscay. Within days of her arrival in Australia, they married at the manse in Williamstown, Victoria, and made their way up to Wanganella. Today it would take around 4 hours driving to get from Williamstown to Wanganella, so you can imagine how long it would take in a horse and cart. So back to Tom. By the age of 24, he was working as a station manager and a stockman at Gilbert River in Queensland, around 4 hours southwest of Cairns at the Green Hills Cattle Station. Tom enlisted in World War I on the 10th of January 1916 at Cairns in Queensland, and he sailed out from Sydney on the 20th of April 1916 on the SS Hawke's Bay. He listed previous service of 2.5 years in the Mounted Rifles at Echuca in Victoria, which would have been prior to his move up to Queensland. He arrived in Egypt on the 9th of August 1916 and joined the 12th Battalion in France. He was then transferred to the 1st Anzac Cycle Battalion on the 22nd of November 1916, serving in France. And in my episode on his brother Phil Bayliss, in episode 8, Military Man, I give a detailed description of what the cyclist corps' contribution was to the war. So please revisit that episode if you need information on that. Tom suffered from trench fever on the 20th of May 1918 and was hospitalised. He returned to Australia on the Ajana on the 19th of August 1919 and was discharged from the military on the 2nd of December 1919. By mid-December 1919, so virtually straight away, he returned to his job at Gilbert River, and he married Mildred Eggington Green on the 28th of April 1920 in Georgetown, Queensland. Tom was 28 and Mildred was 22. They married at Mildred's parents' property, Wollaston. And just a little background to Mildred. So she was born on the 21st of March 1898 in Queensland. She was known to her family as Midge, and she was the daughter of Edward Thaddeus Green and Jane Lindsay. Edward Green was an Englishman, and he was a grazier when he immigrated to Queensland. And Mildred was the 8th child of 13. So Mildred and Tom both came from very large families. Tom and Mildred had 2 sons, Len on the 5th of March 1921 and Colin on the 19th of May 1922, both registered in Cairns in Queensland. By 1924, Tom had acquired mining interests and started mining at Edie Creek in Papua New Guinea. He secured mining rights at Bululo, north of Edie Creek, in 1925. Tom was still continuing his manager's position at Green Hill Station at this time, and by 1931, Tom and his family were living between Papua New Guinea and Sydney. By all accounts, he's doing very well over at Papua New Guinea, and I'm just going to read you some articles that feature from 1938. The first one is from the Cairns Post on the 5th of December 1938. Bululo Pioneers, arrival in Cairns, family trip by air. One of the few families to make the trip from New Guinea to Cairns by air arrived on Saturday by the WRC airliner Coronia. Mr. Tom Bayliss, accompanied by his wife and 2 sons, Len and Colin, an early pioneering family of the Bululo goldfields, are at the Hotel Pacific. 12 years ago, mining in New Guinea attracted the attention of Mr. Bayliss, who first commenced searching for gold at Edie Creek. After 2 years, he directed his attention to the Bululo goldfields, since when he has carried out considerable developmental work there. His wife is one of the biggest landowners in the field. In all, their land comprises of about 1,500 acres. Mr. Bayliss stated last night that the biggest company operating on the Bululo field is the Bululo Gold Dredging Company. At present, they had 6 dredges complete and 2 others under construction. There were about 40 or 50 individual miners on the field. He added that to start off operations at Bululo at present, it would require a fairly large sum for the construction of plant, etc. Plane traffic was the principal means of transport to the various fields, but the proposals under construction for the construction of roads are attracting keen attention. A survey is now being made for a road from Salamoa to the Goldfield. When this road is constructed, it will provide much easier and less costly facilities for the conveyance of goods and machinery to the field. The absence of a bridge over the Bululo River has caused much inconvenience, but a bridge is now being constructed and will give one stretch of road 37 miles long. He added that the first government post office was now in course of construction, and the Bululo Gold Dredging Company has also constructed a large government strong room, which are important additions at Bululo. Len and Colin Bayliss, who are accompanying their parents, were the first two children on the Edie Creek field. They are on their way to New South Wales to join the New South Wales Aero Club to study flying, navigation and wireless, which will entail about 12 months tuition. Within the next few weeks, Mr. Bayliss will visit the tableland and will then proceed to Georgetown and the Gulf by car. Mr. and Mrs. Bayliss are very well known in those districts. After returning from the Gulf, they will proceed to Sydney. And then a month later, on the 7th of January 1939, when they're still travelling around in Australia, there's a small article titled Homemaking on the Goldfield. An example of the Australian love for home building is provided in the efforts of Mr. and Mrs. T.W. Bayliss of Bululo in mandated New Guinea, who were former residents of North Queensland. Mr. Bayliss, who has been doing well with his gold mine, has had a comfortable house erected with an electricity plant to supply light and power, and the family keeps in touch with the world by their wireless. Mr. Bayliss imported over 100 citrus trees from a Sydney merchant and 12 mango trees, which came from canned stock, and they are flourishing. These mango trees are the only ones on the Morobe goldfields. And another article, Mr. T.W. Bayliss, a gold mine owner at Bululo, mandated New Guinea, who was well known in the Cairns, Etheridge and Gulf districts before going to the territory in 1926, will, with his wife and two sons, leave Cairns today to motor to Sydney in continuation of their holiday in Australia. The sons, aged 16 and 17, who intend joining the ANA Aviation School, are natives of Cairns. Mrs. Bayliss will probably stay 12 months in Australia with the boys, while Mr. Bayliss will return to New Guinea next month. Last week, Mr. Bayliss revisited Georgetown and met friends he had known when he was manager of Green Hills Cattle Station at the Gilbert River, and while in Cairns, the family stayed at the Hotel Pacific. Another small article, Mr. T.W. Bayliss of Bululo, New Guinea, who is accompanied by his wife and two sons, is motoring to Sydney. They broke the journey at Maclean owing to the illness of Mrs. Bayliss, who is suffering from an attack of malaria. Mr. Bayliss has gold mining interests in Bululo, where mining is being carried on very extensively. And then there's a very detailed account in the Daily Examiner, a Grafton paper, on the 31st of January 1939, which covers a lot of Tom's comments about New Guinea. Mandated territory, New Guinea visitor. Australian control satisfactory, gold mining developments. As briefly reported in Saturday's issue of the Daily Examiner, Mr. T.W. Bayliss of the mandated territory of New Guinea broke his motor journey from Cairns to Sydney at Maclean last week owing to the illness of his wife, who was an inmate of Truro Private Hospital, suffering from an attack of malaria. Mr. Bayliss, in company with his wife and two sons, came by plane from the territory to Cairns, and from Cairns is motoring to Sydney. Mr. Bayliss managed a large grazing property in the Gulf of Carpentaria prior to going to New Guinea with his family. They went to New Guinea some 15 years ago and settled at Salamau, which has recently been selected as the capital of the territory in place of Rabaul. Soon after his arrival, Mr. Bayliss acquired mining interests on the Bululo River. He was among the first to engage in mining there, and he has seen it grow into a very thriving mining area. The white population of Bululo, Wow and Edie Creek has grown to approximately 2,500. At Bululo, one mine dredging company is producing 500,000 pounds worth of gold a month. Wow, 3,500 feet above sea level, is the main mining town of the goldfields. It is some 50 miles inland from the coast and has a white population of over 1,000. It has 2 hotels, a branch of the Bank of New South Wales, and a school attended by some 40 white children and other public services. 16 miles below Wow is, at an altitude of 1,000 feet, is the mining centre of Bululo River, which has a white population of 400, most of whom are employed by the Bululo Gold Dredging Company. Its capital is mostly American, and most of the technical staff are Americans. This company has 6 large dredgers working and 2 under construction. The largest of these dredgers can dig down 108 feet. All of them have been profitably worked for some years and are yielding a total of approximately £50,000 a month. In addition to the whites, the company employs some 1,300 natives. The gold obtained from their operations is shipped to Australia. In addition to the company, there are several individual mines working for alluvial gold, among them being mines owned by Mr. and Mrs. Bayliss. The gold mining company at Bulolo provides all facilities for its employees, its own picture show, stores, medical offices and freezing works. Recently a road was constructed between Bulolo and Wau by the government, who also built a bridge across the river. Although this road is trafficable, most people desiring to do business with Wau prefer flying, as by those means it only takes some 6 minutes. Edie Creek, which is 7,500 feet above the seaboard, is very mountainous country and is practically an all-Australian settlement. The New Guinea Goldfields Company has its headquarters at Edie Creek. There is a hotel and other public essentials at Edie Creek, with the population being some 100 white people. A road from Wau to Edie Creek has been constructed, a distance of 13 miles, allowing for the transport of products to and from Edie Creek to Wau. From Wau to Salamaua, which is the shipping port for the goldfields, it takes 80 days to carry goods on foot, compared with only 3 minutes by plane, and practically the whole of the transport is by plane. Salamaua has been selected by the Commonwealth Government as the future capital of the mandated territory. When, owing to repeated damage suffered in Rabaul from earthquakes, the government decided to remove the capital. 2 sites were under consideration, Salamaua and Lae. But following the visit of Mr. W.M. Hughes, the territory, Salamaua, was selected. Salamaua is about 18 miles from Lae. The Markham River, which runs into the Gulf near Salamaua, is only navigable for a few miles. When 80 miles up the river, the land is only 100 feet above sea level. This open, undulating valley comprises some 100,000 acres, which will, according to Mr. Bayliss, grow any tropical crop. It would be possible to connect this country with the seaboard by railway, and if developed, it would be a very rich asset to New Guinea. Mr. Bayliss considers the soil equal to the best found in North Queensland, but at present is under native control. This land has not much timber, but it is covered with a tall grass called cooney, grass that is similar in appearance to the sword grass found along the coastal districts of New South Wales. Some time ago, a company was desirous of establishing works for the manufacture of this grass into paper pulp, but could not get the concession sought, and a project having in mind the expenditure of some £500,000 had to be abandoned. The Bulolo River empties into the Wutut, and that river runs into the Markham. The average rainfall on the Bulolo River is about 75 inches. The Bulolo is a freshwater stream and is very treacherous during heavy downpours of rain. The flats along its banks are subject to flooding. It is timbered with tropical jungle. There are millions of feet of valuable pine and cedar, while there is a good class of durable hardwood timber called Quila, which is superior to the hardwood timbers found in Australia. New Guinea has another valuable asset in its timber. Mr. Bayliss stated that under the Commonwealth administration, splendid progress is being made, and the population are quite satisfied to be under the existing control. There are a number of Germans living there, and most of them are more than satisfied to be under mandated rule. The people in the mandated territories, said Mr. Bayliss, would to a man resent the handing over of New Guinea to Germany or any other outside power, and when Mr. Hughes was in the territory, he could not help noticing that impression in the minds of the people. That said, Mr. Bayliss probably prompted him to speak as plainly as he did in regard to that connection when he was in Rabaul. Most of the Australian population in the territory are returned soldiers, and every one of them has a high respect and confidence in Mr. Hughes. Speaking from a defence point, Mr. Bayliss said it would be a very grave thing for Australia if the mandated territories were taken away from British rule, as it would provide an aerial base, making it possible for any invading power to attack Australia, as it took only 4 hours flying to reach the Australian coast from New Guinea, the distance from Port Moresby to Cooktown being only some 400 miles. He considered the Australian people were the most casual people in the world, and they must wake up to the dangers threatening them from invasion, and do everything possible to avert such a calamity. He is a great admirer of Mr. Hughes, who he considers has the vision to see what we must face if we do not make the necessary effort to prepare everything for the defence of our country. Dealing with the matters of administration in the Territory, Mr. Bayliss referred to Mr. Harold Page, a native of the Clarence River, who holds high rank in the office of the Administrator in the Territory, who is a very diligent officer, highly respected by everyone in the Territory. Wowes, said Mr. Bayliss, with its 3,500 feet altitude, would make an excellent tourist resort, particularly in the hot summer months, as there was very little change in the climatic conditions, the temperature seldom going over 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The Territory generally was fairly healthy, except for tropical malaria. So you can tell that Tom's definitely seen as a man of authority and a good businessman over Papua New Guinea. On the 25th of April 1939, Tom was badly injured. His hand required skin grafts, and he also had head injuries from a tyre blowout at Bululo, and he was brought to Sydney for treatment. And I'll just read a small article from the Brisbane Courier Mail on the 1st of May 1939. The heading says, "Skin will be grafted on whole of hand." After travelling since 7 a.m. on Saturday as a stretcher case, Mr. T.W. Bayliss, a Bululo gold miner, arrived from New Guinea by the W.R. Carpenter airliner Coronia at 1:15 p.m. yesterday. Later he left by the plane for Sydney, where skin will be grafted on the whole of his left hand, which was injured in a motor smash. Mr. Bayliss, who owns a large block on Bululo Goldfield, was driving back from placing wreaths on the graves of Australian war veterans at Salamua when the car capsized. His companion, Mr. Leonard Joyner, 45, business manager of Salamua, was killed, and Mr. Bayliss had the skin torn from his left hand and suffered severe head injuries. So luckily Tom recovered from that motor crash, and in September 1945 it was reported in a Cairns newspaper that the well-known businessman of Bululo, Andrew Ball, was in Cairns in the capacity of liaison officer to arrange civilian prisoners of war arriving in Cairns from Papua New Guinea. So this is at the end of World War II. Tom, in fact, had signed up for World War II and fought in Papua New Guinea. And a little glimpse of his service there. It was mentioned in his World War I record, and it says in 1962 he wrote to the AIF requesting his army discharge papers, as the originals had been, and his quote, blown up by the Japanese in 1942. And just to also keep in mind with Mildred and the boys, well, Mildred was living back at Georgetown in 1942. No doubt they would have been urged to evacuate Papua New Guinea with the onset of the war and the Japanese attacks. Tom and Mildred divorced around 1950. She lived at Bululo until 1954, when she sold the Golden Hill mine in Bululo to a syndicate, and she died in Chatswood, Sydney in 1956. She was 58 years old, and she left the entirety of her will to her son Colin. Tom went on to marry Anna Johanna Olling on the 16th of June 1952 in Mandang, Papua New Guinea. He was 60 and Anna was 54. Anna was German. She was born in Waterschei, Germany on the 7th of May 1898, and she had been married previously with children of her own, like Tom. She had married Peter Karl Munster, known as Charlie, in about 1922 in England, and they departed England on the 20th of February 1923, bound for PNG. I'm just going to divert for a moment to talk to you about Anna's first husband, Peter Karl Munster, or Charlie Munster. He had a very interesting history prior to marrying Anna, and unfortunately for him, the war played a part in his demise. So Peter Karl Munster, also known as Charlie, was 17 years older than Anna. He was also German, and he arrived in Sydney at the age of 22 on the 3rd of February 1904. He travelled back and forth from Lord Howe Island and the Solomon Islands for at least 4 years. He had a daughter, Annie Johanna Munster, in 1908. Annie was born on Lord Howe Island, and her mother was a Polynesian princess, Vauli. She was the daughter of what was known as a pirate king on Lord Howe Island, and Vauli, her mother, died soon after giving birth. So Annie was placed in the care of a lady that was known as Queen Emma. So her father handed her over into the care of Queen Emma. Queen Emma's real name was Emma Eliza Coe, and she was the daughter of an American and a high-status Polynesian girl. Queen Emma created a commercial empire in Papua New Guinea, and when Queen Emma died in 1913, Annie was placed in a Catholic mission near Rabaul. She left the convent mission when she was 17. After Charlie and Anna married, they moved to Lorengo on Manus Island, where Charlie was a plantation owner. He was the only German on Papua New Guinea at the time that was a naturalised British subject. Charlie and Anna had a daughter, Elizabeth Franziska Corolla Munster, on the 11th of August 1928 in Glebe, Sydney. They then had a son, Charles Hans Munster, on the 9th of July 1934 at Lorengo, Manus Island. Charlie leased a plantation, he called it Silesia, on the Purdy Islands near Manus Island in February 1936. He sold copra, which was the flesh of the coconut, and trochus shells that were bored up and used to make buttons and beads at the time. With the advent of World War II, at the end of 1941, Anna evacuated with the children and she lived at Moree West for several years. Charlie died on or around the 18th of March 1943 at Lorengo, Manus Island, aged 61. He was reported missing and presumed to have met his death on a Japanese vessel called Akakazi that was sailing between Manus Island and New Ireland. Evidence indicates the Japanese captured Charlie and other men. They were likely to have been machine gunned and their bodies tossed overboard. Records show that Anna was living at Port Moresby at the time of Charlie's death. From 1946 to 1949, Anna lived in Penrith, New South Wales, a suburb of Sydney, and Anna was the sole beneficiary of Charlie's will. It took quite a while for Charlie's will to go to probate, as they needed to have proof how Charlie died and where Charlie died. And she commenced a long case to ensure that the proceeds of the sale of a large amount of copra were administered in the will. October 1946 right through to April 1948, in public records there are many letters going between Anna's solicitors and the solicitors that were administering Charlie's will. There was also a complication in the will in respect to ownership of the Silesia plantation. Charlie must have moved from leasing it to owning it at some point, and the problem was that the US forces utilised Charlie's land in the war, and the value and ownership of the land was debated, and the fight continued right up until October 1955. The reason why it took so long was that Charlie's assets were frozen under the National Security Enemy Property Regulations, as the army initially believed that Charlie was in Japan during the war. So they were assuming that Charlie was an ally or a spy with Japan. Documentation then had to be produced showing his presumed death. So they had a full understanding that in fact he was killed by the Japanese. And this then allowed proceedings to continue. So the proceedings didn't continue for everything to be finalised until October 1952. So it took 3 years in total, back and forth between Charlie's solicitors and Anna's solicitors. Anna lived in Sydney with Tom once they married. Tom was still the director of the Bulolo Alluvials Limited, and he shared his time between Sydney and Papua New Guinea. I found an article online that was from a journal by L.J. Brass in the 6th Archbold Expedition to New Guinea, March the 14th, 1959 to January 24th, 1960, and it's a part of his journal. He wrote, "I returned to Lae after lunch at the Pine Lodge Hotel. A few miles on the road from Bulolo, we called in to see an old friend of mine named T.W. Bayliss. Tom had been in the Goldfields area since 1926. He took up an extensive bit of auriferous ground early in the piece and held on to it. He and his son Colin are now profiting from gold sluicing. Tom presented to me a fine example of prehistoric stone mortar, larger than most I have seen, which was unearthed last year, 40 feet below the surface in his sluicing operations. The mortar was in use as a bird bath at the foot of Tom's front steps. It will go to the museum. Tom was always a teller of tales. Finding an eager listener, he held forth about the old gold prospecting days, being shot with cuckoo arrows, etc. Also, his boys have told him there is some mammal in the forest of their native mountains in the direction of Mount Missum, a fairly large mammal, which eats their garden crops and seems unknown to white men and perhaps even the natives. Tom has seen very large bones, which were unearthed in the Bulula area, but no small bones. Tom passed away on the 3rd of November 1975 in Sutherland, a suburb of Sydney, aged 84. Anna stayed in Sydney until just before her death, where she lived at Belga in Western Australia, where she was living with Carl Anthony Shane Munster, which I am assuming may be a grandson. Anna died in 1980 in Perth, aged 82. And now I'm just going to give you some information about Tom and Mildred's two boys, Len and Colin. So Len Bayliss was born on the 5th of March 1921 in Cairns, Queensland at St Margaret's Private Hospital. At the age of 9, Len was brought with his brother from PNG to enrol in the Church of England Grammar School in Brisbane. And there is an article that outlines their enrolment at the school. It's in the Brisbane Telegraph, February 1934. It's titled Boys from New Guinea. Dear crew, on a ship this week I met 3 boys, lead rather an interesting life. I thought you might like to hear about them. They were Douglas Anderson, 15, and Len and Colin Bayliss, aged 11 and 12, and they were returning to school from New Guinea. Douglas, who goes to the Brisbane Boys College, lives at Wau, and Len and Colin, who attend the Church of England Grammar, live at Bululo. When I asked them whether their homes were far apart, they said, about 13 miles, but only about 7 minutes by plane. And evidently in that part of the world, it's the usual method of describing distance. Wau and Bululo are New Guinea goldfield settlements. They are picturesque places, hemmed in by forest, covered mountains, and all communication with the coast is made by aeroplane. I rather fancy that would suit some of the crew pretty well. You may have read in the papers about the huge weights the machines carry. Counting a very young baby, there are only 4 other children, all boys in Bululo besides the Bayliss boys, who happen to be the eldest. However, they find plenty to do on their holidays. Their father has the contract for the clearing of timber for the dredging, and they spend a good deal of time watching the activities. They play tennis too, and then, since mining places always gather men of all nationalities, there are interesting people to talk to, Americans, Dutch and Spanish. Douglas likes to watch his father on his claim in Wau, where, by the way, there is a school with about 11 white children. The boys said the monkeys, and in brackets native children, think white children are very amusing and usually gather around to stare. The young travellers had quite a number of companions on the trip down, for there were ever so many children returning to school. Yours, the skipper. In 1938, aged 19, Len joined the New South Wales Aero Club to study flying, navigation and wireless for 12 months. And in January 1939, he joined the A&A Aviation School in Sydney, both of which the brothers together joined. Len enlisted as a pilot officer on probation on the 19th of August 1940. He had previously had 18 months flying, 550 hours clocked up in fact, and he had been a flying instructor at the 4th Elementary Flying Training School at the Kingsford Smith Flying School in Randwick. And just a little side story, my grandmother recalls and has a photo to show of Len and Colin coming down to her father's property between Deniliquin and Finley in New South Wales from Sydney in 1938, and my grandmother and her 2 sisters being very excited knowing that cousin Len and cousin Colin were coming in on their little plane to visit their Uncle George. On the 18th of November 1940, Len died in an aircraft accident at Mascot in New South Wales. And I'm just going to read you the details of this accident. The first article is titled Pilot Officer Bayliss Killed in a Plane Accident, Native of Cairns. Pilot Officer Len Bayliss, eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. T.W. Bayliss of Bululu, who was killed in an aeroplane accident in Sydney on November the 18th, 1940, was a native of Cairns. His parents were well known in this city, where they resided prior to going to New Guinea many years ago. The late Pilot Officer Bayliss was 19 years of age and was flying at 16. The accident occurred when instructing a pupil. It is believed that he fell about 3,500 feet from the plane. He had 550 flying hours before he joined the RAAF and was given a full Air Force funeral. The deceased was educated at the Church of England Grammar School, Brisbane, and at the age of 17 began flying as a pupil at the Royal Aero Club at Mascot, Sydney. He secured his B licence in September 1939 and obtained his instructor's licence in December of that year. Before joining the RAAF, the late Pilot Officer Bayliss was instructing at Macquarie Grove Flying School, Camden, and later at the Kingsford Smith Flying School at Mascot. He won several trophies for flying and acrobatics, including the Aerial Derby on December 26, 1939. Len Bayliss and his brother Colin were the first European children on the Morobe Goldfield. They arrived in Salamoa in 1927 and came to Wau in 1928. Later that year, they walked with their parents to Edie Creek. This resulted in Warden McLean sending a radio to the then Administrator Brigadier General Wisdom, saying that 2 children had walked to the new Goldfield, and a certificate to this effect was issued. Advice received from Mr. Bayliss at Bululu stated that his son Colin, 18, is also a pilot and proposes to go to America shortly to continue flying studies. In another article, fateful fall from trainer aircraft. On this day, Pilot Officer Len Bayliss was killed when he accidentally fell from a Tiger Moth trainer while it was performing a slow roll at 3,200 feet over the Sydney suburb of Randwick. The 19-year-old instructor with No. 4 Elementary Flying Training School at Mascot had just told his pupil to roll the aircraft over into the inverted position when he was seen to fall from the front cockpit. He was not wearing a parachute and his safety harness had become detached. An inquiry established that the clip holding his harness was attached to a lap strap by a length of cord to prevent loss while not in use, and when the slack was taken up, as occurred during aerobatics, the clip could be released. This was not the first time a RAAF instructor has fallen out of an aircraft during training, but on the earlier occasion, a parachute had prevented tragedy. There was an inquest into the death of Len, and this outlines the coroner's findings. Pilot Bayliss's death, coroner's finding, Sydney, December the 6th. The City Coroner, Mr. Oram, at the conclusion of his inquest, said he was satisfied that pilot instructor Len Bayliss had fallen from a plane over Randwick on November the 18th because the harness which should have secured him in the plane had come undone. How that had happened would probably never be known. Mr. Oram returned a finding of accidental death. He said there was not the slightest suggestion in the evidence that Bayliss had committed suicide. Leading aircraftsman Arthur Wellesley Clark of the RAAF said that while he was piloting an RAAF training plane, Bayliss, his instructor, told him to make a slow roll to the left. They were 3,200 feet up. From an inverted position, he saw Bayliss fall from the front cockpit, clutching at the plane as he fell. Robert John Watts, a flight engineer employed by Air Flight Proprietary Limited, said that he examined the plane immediately after it returned to Mascot. He found the harness which Bayliss had used in perfect condition. He had experimented with the harness on himself. After locking it in at a high position, he had found that by a sudden thrust upwards, it was possible for the locking pin to pull out because of the pull of the cord to which it was attached. Tom and Mildred's second son, Colin, he was born on the 19th of May 1922 in Cairns. Colin, as his brother was educated at the Church of England Grammar School in Brisbane and accompanied his brother to the aviation training schools. Colin enlisted in World War II on the 6th of March 1942 in Paddington, Sydney, New South Wales. His occupation at the time of enlistment was alluvial miner, so by this point he was well and truly involved in the mining operations over at Papua New Guinea. He originally enlisted as a private in the AIF under the 2nd 1st Australian Transportation Company, but by the 14th of August 1942 he re-enlisted to serve as a flying officer in the RAAF. He flew from Australia to Canada and served from 1943 to 1945 there. He was discharged from the Army on the 14th of November 1945. He became engaged to Mary June Steele, known as June, in January 1946 and married her on the 12th of February 1947 at St Mark's at Darlington Point, New South Wales, aged 24. They had 3 children, Len, Colin Jr. and Sue. Len Laidlaw Bayliss was born in 1948 in Sydney. He continued the flying tradition and became a pilot officer in the Special Duties Branch at Toowoomba, Queensland in 1983 and was a squadron leader by 2005, and he's also a solicitor. Colin Bruce Bayliss entered the Army. He was at Puckapunyal in Victoria in 1972 and lived at Kawana near Fremantle, Western Australia in the late 1970s, working as a supervisor. Colin Sr. continued his parents' mining interests in Bulolo in Papua New Guinea. He was mining there in 1949 and was still mining there up until about 1980 when they were living at Indooroopilly in Queensland. And online I found an interesting article that gives you a little bit of an understanding of Colin as a person and the ongoing Bulolo mining interests. It's titled "The Man Who Fell from the Sky." This was the first of what I hope would be a series of interesting anecdotes about people I have met or known and whom I have found interesting. It is for me the first step in writing down anecdotes I've heard so they're not lost forever. In the 70s and 80s I lived and worked in Papua New Guinea. During this time I met many fascinating people, heard many fascinating stories, some true, some not so true, and many that were downright lies. One such person was Colin, or Cole Bayliss. Cole was a gold miner in Bulolo. Bulolo was a town where I lived from 1978 to 1982. It had a long history as a company town from the time gold was discovered in the Bulolo River. Bulolo Gold Dredging Limited was the first company in this town. The company flew in the parts to build 8 massive gold dredgers that weighed 2,000 to 3,000 tonnes each. These dredgers sucked up the floor of the Bulolo Valley and extracted hundreds of ounces of alluvial gold. The town thrived with its own offices, banks, smelter, theatre, bakery, stores, hospital, golf course, bowls club and much more. Cole Bayliss's parents had staked a claim to an area outside Bulolo which they mined by sluicing. They, or rather their native labour line, cut miles of water races through the nearby hills. This water flowing down was channelled through metal pipes into a nozzle, and a high-pressure jet of water washed the gold-bearing gravel through a series of sluice boxes with riffles and rubber mats. The riffles and rubber mats captured the gold, which was panned off and amalgamated with mercury and sold to the bank as sponge gold. Cole lived in Bulolo as a child and joined the RAAF at the beginning of World War II. During the war, he was seconded into the RAF and became a fighter pilot. After the Second World War, Cole returned to Bulolo and continued mining just in the way that his father did. He was a likeable bloke, well-read, and fond of quoting the old snippet of Shakespeare, Kipling or Wordsworth. Saturday afternoon saw him propped up at the bar at the golf club, sipping on a beer or whiskey, always dressed in a starched white shirt with grey or khaki trousers. One of the stories I heard from Cole during my time in Bulolo was how his brother Len died in an aircraft accident in Brisbane while training to be a pilot, at the same time Cole was undergoing training. This was almost a passing comment when I heard it, and I certainly didn't pursue it at the time. In 1996, however, I was working in Brisbane and I recall reading of an aircraft accident in a brief newspaper article that mentioned the name Bayliss. I put 2 and 2 together and thought it may have been the accident that claimed Cole's brother. Some weeks later, I had come down from the office I was working in on the 38th floor of an office tower to walk around the block for a bit of exercise, and who should I jump into? Cole Bayliss. I had not seen of him or heard from him since I left Bulolo in 1982. We exchanged the usual greetings, and I found that he'd now gone finished from Bulolo and was living on a property near Toowoomba. I told him of the article I'd seen in the newspaper, and I promised I would contact the paper and try and get a print for him. But I have never been able to locate Cole Bayliss since then. Colin passed away at Toowoomba, Queensland on the 3rd of March 2013, aged 90 years. So I hope you enjoyed my story of Thomas Weaver Bayliss and the interesting people and also the tragic events that were part of his family tree. If you are interested in allowing me to share your story on a future episode, please go to my Facebook page, Family History Mysteries, and send me a message. Or if you are having difficulties with your family tree and would like me to assist you in developing a little more detail to create some stories similar to like I have been in my episodes, please message me.